Hey everyone, my name is Carlson Herbert, and my group picked the Brooklyn, New York site. It was really interesting, and really enjoyed learning about the site, and I wanted to share a little bit about it with you. The city of Brooklyn, New York is about 2.6 million people, and it's pretty much directly south of New York City. You can actually see the main city skyline from the site. It has a very dense urban fabric. It also has a lot of cultural diversity. Over 40% of the residents speak a second language other than English, as well as pretty high poverty rates. So there's a lot of need here for this community that a school or educational system could really help with. The neighborhood we're in is really close to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The East River is directly to the north of the site. Williamsburg is over to the east. Dumbo and downtown Brooklyn are kind of to the west, southwest, and then Clinton Hill and Fort Greene are to the south. The site's about 20 minutes or so from Statue of Liberty and about 30 minutes from the Empire State Building, of course, depending on traffic, which is a very big factor in New York City. Also, the site context for the immediate site, it's currently kind of an empty parking lot, storage yard area next to a two-story warehouse building. It does border a pretty busy road. It's across the street from a small gas station. It's really close to ferry access, as well as lots of kind of maker spaces and places that are being redeveloped. It's also down the road from the Brooklyn Grange, which is a rooftop garden kind of farm area, and then directly connected to the Brooklyn Naval Yard, which has been around since pretty much World War II. And that's just a little bit about the site. So each of our group members here are going to break down different portions of that in more detail.
Hi, my name is Logan Shear, and as we look into the urban scale of our site, we can see that Brooklyn, and we wanted to showcase Brooklyn in the context with the rest of New York City. So this first map is a representation of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. And we wanted to showcase this because understanding the scale of New York City is relatively hard to do unless you've been there to take it all in. And as we zoom in a little bit closer on the site, this map is a representation of the neighborhoods that make up Brooklyn. Our site is located at the Brooklyn Navy Yard towards the northern part of the Brooklyn borough. And with the amount of neighborhoods that Brooklyn has, and each one having their own individual identity, this map showcases the diversity that Brooklyn has, and something that we want to consider greatly as we move forward through the progress of our design process the rest of the semester. As I investigated the climate, my immediate response was, well, it's New York, so it's cold. The warm season lasts from about June to September with an average daily high temperature of 75, with the hottest month usually being July, with an average high temperature of 83, with a low of 71. The cold season lasts from about December to March, where the average daily high is usually below 48 degrees. This map itself represents the heat island effect that can be seen in Brooklyn and in other extremely dense areas. And nearly 78% of the city's population are exposed to temperatures elevated at least 8 degrees. So pairing the heat island effect and with climate change, we can expect Brooklyn's temperatures to continue to rise in the future and continue to have an elevated feels-like temperature. When I noticed our site was located at the Navy Pier, the first thing I thought of was, well, New York is sinking, which we heard about 6 months ago or something like that. And along with that, paired with rising sea levels due to global warming, I wanted to showcase a map that represents the areas of Brooklyn that are the most susceptible to flooding. So the wetter seasons usually last from April to August, with a greater than 29% chance of a given day being a wet day. The month with the most wet days is July, with an average of 10.3 days being considered wet, and the drier season lasting from about September to March. The month with the fewest wet days in Brooklyn is January, with an average of about 7.3 days being considered wet, and the month of the most days of rain alone is going to be July, with an average of 10.3 days. The last thing I wanted to look into was the wind speed and the direction of the wind in Brooklyn. We know that Brooklyn experiences westerly winds, and this wind rose diagram at the top right of the screen here represents not only the wind direction, but the wind velocity as well. And paired with global warming and trying to be considerate of climate change, these wind speeds are going to decrease if we continue on the rate that we are over most of the western U.S. and East Coast, but the central will see an increase. And the slowing in these surface winds could disrupt the Gulf Stream, contributing to more drought and more intense winter storms, which New York is extremely susceptible to, given its location in the world.
Hello. So my portion of the project was to investigate the site that we have in Brooklyn. at the neighborhood context. So this was the first map that I created, and it was sort of an overview of the area, looking at where the site was located, right along the East River. It is here in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is being redeveloped. It's currently it was an industrial area. It's still an industrial area. It's owned industrial, but it is being redeveloped into commercial spaces, including restaurants and um, offices and so forth. You can also see that there are some parks in this area. So there are a couple parks that are nearby. I investigate that a little bit further. The Brooklyn Park, a lot of commercial space, a lot of residential. Most of what is not highlighted is residential space. And then there are quite a few educational spaces as well. So I took a deeper dive into some of those educational spaces, listing out about 15 schools that are all very relatively close to our site. Again, here is our site, and a couple parks as well. So there's Fort Greene Park, which is a large park. The Brooklyn Bridge Park is just here. And then Commodore Berry Park is a smaller park, but it's very close to our site. And in terms of these schools, there are a multitude of different types of schools, whether they're elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, or even colleges and technical schools. And then here I also looked at transportation for our site. There is lots of great transportation, whether it's a bike line that goes right near it. You can rent a city bike here. Bus stops, there's one right at our site. There's a bus stop, and the buses can carry you really anywhere. The metro line's a little bit further away, but it's still within walking distance and getting to it. And then there's also a ferry that can take you up and down the East River over to Manhattan and so forth. So great walking area, biking area, or public transportation in terms of metro buses or the ferry. Looking at the demographics, it's a pretty condensed area. There's 99,600 people who live in this area. It's considered Brooklyn Community District 2. And so within that community district, it has a density of 35,000 people per square mile. The median age of people is 25 to 34. And then if you look at the breakdown of the demographics, there are majority are white, non-Hispanic, but it's a slightly diverse area as well. Pretty split between male and female. Most of the people who live in this area are U.S. citizens and U.S. born. And it is a fairly well-educated area with 67% of the people living there having a college degree. And then a couple other statistics that the unemployment rate's fairly low, 4.4%, 12% are under that poverty line, and only 7% do not have English proficiency. So. And then looking at zoning, I jumped into zoning as well. You can see here, this is where our site is located. It is zoned M2-1. However, the Brooklyn Navy Yard is considered a special purpose district. I have a link to that special purpose district below. So it can be used for a college, a university, or a school. It's considered a community space, so it can be used as a group 3A. In terms of the floor area ratio, I found that it was 2.0, and that the max building height, you can see right here from this map, is set at 60 feet. So this wall right here can be 60 feet before there is a setback. And then just looking at the Brooklyn Navy Yard master plan, this was a quote from the developer of that space, which was XYZ Studio, I'm sorry, YXY Studio. So it was a manufacturing space that they're creating a new vertical manufacturing space that will allow 30,000 people to work in it in the yard by 2030. So like I said, lots of great different developmental sites popping up along here, community spaces, gathering spaces, restaurants, breweries, so forth, have all developed in this area, and new construction is happening as well. And then I just looked at a couple other neighborhoods that were nearby that would probably serve into this school. So you have Fort Greene that has a lot of brownstones. It's a little bit more upper class than the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And then you also have Clinton Hill, which is a highly residential neighborhood as well. So, and you can see that the Pratt Institute is right here within Clinton Hill.
So going into our Brooklyn site, so right here in this little orange spot is gonna be our site, about 30,000 square feet, 150 by 200 feet. Right on the corner of Flushing and Clinton Avenue, kind of a little bit. Flushing Avenue is gonna be more of our busier main access way. So going into some of the landscaping and vegetation of the area, so there's not really much landscaping around it besides like what landscaping you would get with the kind of like parking islands and just end of property line landscape setbacks possibly, but a lot of these buildings are kind of like zero lines, so they're built right up to their property line, being especially in the industrial zone. So the only spots of landscaping area is mainly by some of the parking areas. A little bit right here on this main on the roadway around the Navy Yard is they have some landscape areas, but it's more of just like unattended land that kind of like overgrowing. Same thing here, it's like right against Flushing Avenue, it's a little bit more of a landscape buffer, just grass overgrowing with some trees on the side for this gate access. Going into circulation, so we have in purple, or it's gonna be our main vehicle circulation going around the site, kind of like it's all around. Then on this, on Flushing Avenue, it's actually really interesting, is already a dedicated bike lane with a sidewalk next to it, so you kind of have you have a protected bike and walkway. Between the bike lane and the street is like a little mini curb island. Going into the sun setting. So right now we're at this is June when the sun's at its highest at noon, and you see we kind of get like a low shadow between all these buildings. Right here is kind of like our June sun being up pretty high, not exactly 90, but pretty close. Then going out to March, which will be this middle one right here, this middle zone, showing kind of like the hours of the day. And then our arc right here for the sun. So at noon, this is where our sun sits. Again, it's a little bit higher in the sky, so you don't get crazy amount of shadows. It's gonna be a little bit more directly down. Then going into December is when we get our like low sun, and from there is when the shadows really extend because you have such a smaller angle that it come in. So like the taller buildings really extend their shadows across the site. Nothing goes over our site necessarily, just at least from noon time. If you were to go more towards like morning, you would get on the west side would pretty much cover our site, and then maybe sunset. Some of these tall buildings might cover some of it, but on the bottom half it'll be pretty much lower buildings. Going into our flood risk area. So our site's located within the North Atlantic Coastal Plain Aquifer System, which has a depth of about 1,000 to 2,000 feet. And its soil condition for the aquifer is a semi-consolidated sand. So going to our flood risk, so in this blue area, right up against the river, this is going to be a zone 80, which is a base flood elevation of 10 feet, higher risk of flooding in these areas. Then we have zone X shaded, which is 2% to 1% chance of annual flooding, with no base elevation shown on these ones. And then zone X is unshaded, which is less than 2% chance. So it's really like these areas are pretty much safe from flooding, and that has also no base elevation shown. Going into kind of like a sensory inventory, so some of this is speculation, but especially Flushing being our more busier street, this will be where your noise will be coming from. Maybe right here in the southeast corner, you'll have a little bit more noise, but some of the more industrial type businesses and warehouses down there. It's pretty quiet up on the northern east side because these are now kind of like movie studios and not really part of the Navy Yard. So smells you may be getting because we have more of a dominant western winds, and the river is going to be a little bit more to the west side, northwest side. So sometimes you can get a little bit of the smells of the river, depending on the tide coming in from your northwest. And then going kind of into local architecture. So some of the architecture around here is going to be like more of a brick and concrete construction. So we have one which will be right here off of Clinton Avenue, kind of facing towards the Navy Yard, past the Navy Yard towards the river, towards really like downtown New York. You kind of maybe get a glimpse of the Brooklyn Bridge once you get past all these crane towers and everything. Then going down to number 2 in our southeast corner is kind of like one of the buildings that are right next to our site. So kind of like it's all brick, glass on the side, more of an office, industrial building. Going into number 3, which is right off of Vanderbilt Avenue. So this one will be more of an industrial zone kind of area, like light industrial businesses, where some maybe some warehouses. Then going down to our more residential street, number 4, where these are your typical homes on these streets. They're gonna be like kind of townhomes right next to each other, all nice brick. Second level entry pretty much with a lower floor level.
So as you can see here, I started out with pulling in some imagery of the street layout. There's actually an entire layout of kind of the whole New York City area. And then I zoomed in on the site here and pulled in some pieces to give some context. After kind of pulling out that information, I also used Google Maps, looked around the street view to try and get a good idea of what the site looked like, and also scale off of these views so that I can make sure everything was being built true to size. Here's the overall 3D isometric view of the site and surrounding context. It's about a 3,000 foot by 3,000 foot square. And that was because I really wanted to make sure that encompass some of the water from the East River there that you can see as it tied into the Brooklyn Naval Yard. And then also make sure there was enough there as far as the surrounding city neighborhoods towards the south of the site, and then also some of the green space that was towards the east of the site. If you zoom in a little bit on the site there, you can see a little more detail. That green box there is site location. It's basically an empty parking lot there next to a warehouse building, and right there at the front entrance of the Brooklyn Naval Yard. You can kind of see towards the top of your screen. Here's another view of the site there that gets you a little bit closer to being able to see that east side where there's some green space. It's actually like a Navy veterans kind of cemetery green space area over there. A good place for the community. And then also you can see towards kind of the bottom right of your screen the highway that cuts through pretty close to the site. And that's a raised highway kind of going directly above the city streets. And I really wanted to make sure that I had a couple of different shapes of the buildings that were immediately next to the site. I used CAD Mapper to bring in kind of the bulk of the models, but then I did some tweaking because it didn't come in exactly right. So I had to add some dimensions to some or some details to others and kind of play around with those and to make sure that they were pretty realistic of the actual site. And I did a lot of looking through Google Street View to get a better picture of that for myself. One of the main highlights of the site is that it is next to this Brooklyn Naval Yard, which had a very big role historically. And this is where a lot of boats were manufactured around World War II. And from what I can tell, there are still some operations, although it is much more limited than it used to be. And this is a good access for the ferry currently. As you can see, it's pretty close to the site. It's roughly a block or two away. Looking directly south from the site, this is where you can see it's a bunch more kind of 1 to 2 to 3 story business buildings and then some residential buildings as well. And then looking south towards that highway that cuts through. Looking east, that building with kind of the interesting features on top is actually the Steiner Studios. And then looking out to the west here, that tall building has a lot of things tied to the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and it has some interesting shapes up there at the top with some steps and things going on.
So in summary, we have such a great site located just across the East River from Manhattan in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Zooming in up here in this neighborhood on the north. And this location is so diverse, it is so rich in history, and it's such an up and coming, vibrant space in which there is lots of development, new commercial, new residential, new manufacturing spaces being constructed. You can see its rich history here through this image from 1945 of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where boats and ships for the Navy were being manufactured. Another image from 1965, right before it closed in 1966, and how this space is being reimagined, revitalized, reinvigorated. And so it's such a great place for us to locate a school, and thinking about what that future growth will look like. We will need to investigate further the education system that surrounds this area, where the needs are for more education. in this area, and also thinking about how we can tie it into this redevelopment of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So on behalf of Carlton, Logan, Stephen, and myself, thank you for listening to our presentation.